If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this. For those who have encountered scary demons, entities, shadow creatures, paranormal beings, or similar experiences, what was your scariest encounter so far? I lived in a house as a kid up until I was 8, that was rife with shadow people. Almost nightly, they would be in and around my room, sometimes just one and sometimes more than one. They would be in the doorways, peeking around them, at the foot of my bed, or creeping up the stairs. Sometimes they would talk to each other in frightening voices, and one time I remember waking up to one sitting next to me on the edge of my bed. I assumed it was one of my parents and sat straight up and looked at it. One time, and this is crazy, one came at me and made me black out from terror while I was taking a bath in the tub when I was like 6 or 7. It was like a black mist entered the room and took shape next to me. All of this sounds crazy, but once we moved, I never experienced anything like this again. It still gives me goosebumps thinking about it, like 30 years later. When I was growing up, there was a giant forest behind my house that me and my neighborhood friends were in constantly. I got to know those woods really well. When I was about 14 or 15, there was a lot of construction in and around those woods, as the neighbor at the top of the hill was filling in some big area that was just dirt behind his house. In doing so, they demolished a small grove of trees that stood apart from all the others in the middle of the dirt area. After that happened, me and my friends began to hear clicks in the woods. It sounded like rocks clicking together very often. Along with this, we began to see small shadow figures out of the corner of our eyes. These would dart around, hide behind trees, and follow us wherever we went. Sometimes we thought we'd see them in front of us, and then when we went to focus on them, they were gone. My neighborhood friend had Cherokee heritage and said he spoke to his elder and believed it was the Nunahi, the little people of Cherokee legend, forest spirits that protect and live in the forest. One day I also went into the woods, and there were hundreds of dog or coyote prints in the mud on the trails, even though we didn't have any around the area. This went on for several months, and they became more egregious in their tricks. One day my friend woke up in his shower in the middle of the night with the lights on, and when he woke up, he got a huge nosebleed, and the lights went off. They eventually stopped showing up, but not after a series of incidents where they kept following us and became more aggressive, and we stopped going in the woods for a while then. Eventually, the phenomenon went away. Anyone have any similar experiences with anything like this? I haven't been able to find a community where I can discuss this with anyone. A few years back in my first year of college, some friends and I would go on haunted hikes at this place that was about 30 minutes from our school. We would get creeped out, hear stuff following us, but never really saw anything until one night in December. I remember this vividly because of the cold, and it was finals week, and we were trying to make it to a waterfall we had gone to with some other people the week before. The night we went was a full moon, very important because it gave us good visibility and there was no mistaking the experience for something else. Quite a few things happened in the build-up to the actual encounter. But my friend saw one shadow figure that was only an upper torso come out of a tree in the full moonlight, and then as it approached him from the grove of trees it came out of, another figure came out of that one and moved up the trail through the brush, and he heard it going through. He ran back to our group and grabbed the girls with us that night and started yelling at them to run, saying, "There's more than one." I brought up the rear to make sure no one fell behind and we weren't being followed, and as we crossed a bridge that was no more than 10 feet above a creek bed, I felt we were being watched, and I could see us from the creek bed as we ran across. I have this sixth sense, I guess, where if someone or something is watching me, I can see myself through their eyes, and that's what I saw. I stopped midway across, and I had to know what was watching us that night, and that's when I saw it. It was standing on the creek bed, fully illuminated by the moonlight. It was the outline of a person, pitch black, with no discernible features at all. Just pitch black. I guess maybe it was a bit distorted on the edges? I don't really know. But it wasn't a shadow of something because I could see it standing between the rocks and the creek bed. I didn't feel like it was evil. It just felt like we weren't supposed to be there that night. Maybe if we kept going up the trail, something would have happened other than my friends being scared shitless. Anyway, we made it back to the car, and I asked my friend what he meant by "there's more than one." At this point, I didn't say what I had seen because who would believe me, right? And he said, "I was standing there looking into the grove of trees I heard noises coming from, and this shadow thing came out of the tree, but it was only shoulders and a head, but it was pitch black. And then another shadow person, I guess would be the best way to describe it, came out of it and moved up the trail, and that's when I didn't want to stick around and ran back to you guys." I was freaked out because we saw the same exact thing in different places, and I didn't even tell him what I had seen yet. After I told him we were going nuts, it was the first and only time we had ever seen anything out there. We got back to school, and the girls wanted us to walk them to their dorms. After that, He and I went to get food and talked about it the rest of the night. About 5 years ago, my wife and I were coming home from a late job helping to set up a retail store's counters, displays, etc. At the time of our encounter. It was after 2 a.m. The road back to the house we lived in was a little over an hour's drive on a rural road with multiple miles of nearly single-lane, poorly paved road in the redwoods of the Pacific Northwest. As we drove toward the end of the worst part of the road, I sped up to 35 miles per hour. At this point, I noticed a strange phenomenon. The passenger side headlight seemed to have a black shadow of sorts running along the side of the truck. It's difficult to explain, but it was as if this dark spot was consuming the light. Initially, I thought I was tired. My vision blurred, perhaps, and I rubbed my eyes. The phenomenon remained with the truck for a couple hundred yards. A bit shaken, I asked my wife if she had seen something strange. I will never forget her reply. What I could see driving was just the obscure, dark form keeping up with a vehicle moving 35 miles per hour for hundreds of feet. She replied with shock in her voice, "Wait, you saw that too?" I asked what she had seen. From the passenger seat, she saw this thing run down the hillside towards the vehicle, saying it was shaped similar to a large cat, but its form had a smoky appearance. I have often thought of this event and truly wonder what we saw that night. I would love feedback if anyone has similar experiences. I am from Eastern Europe. I will tell you a story that my grandparents and mother used to talk about. My great-grandfather went to the forest to pick up some wood. He went there during the night since it was illegal to take wood from the forest. By chance, he met another man from the village who was doing the same thing. They agreed to stick together. A little time passed when they saw a small billy goat. Its fur was black. My great-grandfather assumed that someone had lost it. They decided to take the billy goat with them in order to share its meat later. They put the billy goat in a sack, and then weird stuff started to happen. The sack became heavier and heavier, and they exchanged it often between them. At some point, the billy goat was so agitated that my great-grandfather said, "Take it easy, billy goat." The paranormal thing is that the goat repeated the same exact words in a weird voice. My great-grandfather had a gun and shot the sack twice. There was nothing but thin air. They were convinced it was the devil since they had in mind to steal wood. During the summer, right before I turned 13, I would often use my mom's cell phone to talk to my best friend for hours. To do this, I would often go outside and sit in the car with the doors locked. I lived in a trailer park just off of I-70 in Missouri at the time, and I was far enough into the park that there was a patch of trees about 200 feet from my trailer. I could see it very clearly from my seat in the car. This particular night, I was about to hang up and head inside when I saw something odd out of the corner of my eyes right along the tree line. I tell my friend to hold on, just in case something bad is about to happen. And I can't tell you how glad I am that I did. Down on the tree line, there was a shadow, human-shaped. Except it wasn't human. The hair on my arm stood up, and I instantly got a headache and felt nauseous. It was running, whatever it was. The run was almost put in slow motion, so it looked very similar to those old cartoon wheels when they spun slowly. There were no details, no face, no fingers, no clothes, no feet, but it stood anywhere between 7 and 9 feet, it seemed. It vanished into the deeper shadows of the woods. Instantly, I felt menacing pressure and eyes on me from some unknown person. I tell my friend what I just saw and that I may be in serious trouble. I turn to my porch, which was about 8 feet away from the driver's side door, where I was sitting, and there is that thing standing directly between my porch and myself. I hear a noise down from the gravel road by the woods, and I turn to see a car coming up. And I remember very clearly saying, "Please stay on the line, Corey. I'm making a run for it while this car passes." As soon as I saw the windshield, I was sure that there would be a witness if anything happened to me. And I ran faster than I had run in my life. I managed to get inside, and I slept with the lights on that night. The first paranormal encounter of my life involved a shadow person. I was about 8 or 9 when this happened. My family and I were standing in my great-aunt's driveway, saying goodbye, before we got in the car to leave. I looked up into the second-floor bedroom window, the light was on, and saw a shadowy person. It was a male figure, and it was facing left, toward a wall with a closet within the bedroom. Then, the shadow person moved into the wall or closet. I say moved because it didn't walk. It was like it was sucked into the wall. I don't know how to explain it. And it was gone. It still freaks me out to talk about it, even 25 years later. I have always loved the outdoors. I enjoy hiking, camping, and just being in nature. But after this last hike, I doubt I'll be spending too much time outdoors. It all started on Saturday, when, after a long, boring, and mundane week at my office job, I decided to go for a hike in the woods by my house. For some context, my house sits up against a gigantic wooded area that stretches on for miles. I usually hike it once a week, sometimes more if I'm on a vacation from work. Now, nothing strange has ever happened to me in those woods. Ever. So I thought nothing of hiking that day. So I got up, got all my supplies ready, and started towards the woods. There is a small dirt path that leads you into the woods, and I usually follow it while I hike. I started along the path and started to soak in all of nature's beauties. Before I knew it, the sun was starting to set, and I decided to turn back. As I was walking towards my house, I heard a noise. It also sounded like whatever was making the noise was a good distance away. I turned around to see if I could find the source of the noise. Nothing. I shrugged it off and continued on toward my house. The sun continued to set, and the light continued to dim. I decided to pull out my flashlight from my backpack so I could see the path ahead of me. As I was doing this, I saw something. Something was hiding behind a tree on the path. At first glance, it seemed to be a dark shadow. I finally found my flashlight in my backpack and turned it on. It was now almost completely dark. I pointed the beam of light in the direction of the shadow. My heart stopped. The shadow was not a shadow at all. I don't know what it was. I still don't. It was tall, at least 6 feet. It had long fingers with sharp claws that gripped the tree it was hiding behind. Its body, the parts that were not hidden by the tree, looked emaciated like it hadn't eaten in a long time. Its arms were long and bony. Its legs were also long and bony. It had no hair at all. But its head was the part that was most horrifying. Its head was round, with red, narrow veins crisscrossing its head. Its eyes were sunken into their sockets, and the pupils were bright red. It had no nose but instead had 2 circular holes where the nose should have been. It also had no ears. Its mouth was spread into a large, wide smile. I could see rows upon rows of sharp, crooked teeth. I was horrified. I fell to the ground, gasping for breath. I made sure to keep my flashlight trained on the creature. The creature walked out from behind the tree and dropped onto all fours. It then proceeded to crawl onto the path and stop in the center of it. I was still gasping for breath when it started to speak in what sounded like the voice of a little girl. "Wanna play?" the creature said. At this, the adrenaline kicked in, and I took off into the woods. I didn't know where I was going, but I continued to run. I could hear the creature begin to scream. For whatever reason, it did not pursue. Eventually, I arrived at the highway that ran through my town and called one of my friends to pick me up. As he was driving me home, I could see him staring at me in the passenger seat. He asked me why I was standing on the side of the highway and why I looked so terrified, but I couldn't speak. My friend dropped me off at my house, and I ran inside. I walked up the stairs and fell onto the bed. I began to cry. I don't know what I encountered in those woods that night, but I can assure you that I will not enter those woods again. When I was little, I used to have these 2 large mirrors as doors for my closet, and they showed the entire room. One day I was in there, and I was walking through my room when I stopped because I forgot what I went in there for and just stared in the mirror at myself, trying to remember. That's when, through the mirror, I could see a blurry thing in only one spot slowly moving through the room towards me. It wasn't dark, it just looked blurry and a little bit gray. It then got very close to me, and I was too scared to move a muscle. I tried to scream, but it wouldn't come out. I was too scared to open my mouth. Then an uncomfortable warmth came over me, and it was usually pretty cool in my room. The warmth felt like energy, kind of like when you put your hand over a pot of boiling water and it feels like warm energy. That doesn't make much sense, but that's how it felt. The blurry thing then just disappeared, and the warmth went away, and I ran out of my room. I was then scared to ever go in my room alone for several years. I couldn't sleep in there because that would cut me to the core, so I got a bunk bed with my sister in her room. I actually find it kind of funny because when I needed to get something from my room, I would run in and find it as quick as I could and then run out. If I couldn't find it fast enough, I would just run out. Then I got rid of those 2 large mirrors, and then I was able to go into my room without running. I am now enjoying spending most of my time in my room. I was probably 5 or 6 years old when I first saw them. If you're unaware of what shadow people are, first off, you're lucky. But to explain, they're tall, skinny, featureless black shadows that wear no clothes and have no hair, nothing at all. I grew up in the town of Oceanside, California, and lived there most of my life. It's believed that shadowy people linger in one place and will not follow you. I would see them here often. They weren't just in my house but on the streets. The most common encounter I had was the man at the end of the bed. I slept at the top of a bunk bed my sister and I shared, and I would often turn my head and see him. He was fairly tall, almost reaching my bunk, around 6. Shadow people do not speak, but they do look. When they see you, they're gone. If they notice you're there, they're gone. A shadow person. It followed her steps before vanishing. I only saw the woman turn the corner in the other direction before we drove off. That was the only time I recall having seen one actually move, walk or run. I've seen them probably 50 times more. I moved into a rental in Idaho when I was 11, and I have lived in a house in Washington since I was 12. I haven't seen them since California. Has anybody else seen them? I can't be alone. So, to start this off, I was around 12 or so at the time and had trouble sleeping. I remember waking up at an early hour, 4 a.m. I ended up going to use the bathroom. After this, I come back into my room. My window facing my bed had the curtains open so I could see through it, but not when it's pitch black out. What originally drew my attention to the window was that I saw lightning outside. It wasn't rainy, so it was more just sky lightning. So, having never seen that before, I went to the window to take a better look. As I looked out my window, I immediately looked toward the yard. In my yard, standing there, was a tall creature. It looked like it could be a Bigfoot, but its body was pitch black. What was scary was that it was looking directly at me. It had these haunting, yellow, glowing eyes. I stared at it for a good 5 seconds before panic and fear set in. I ran into my mother's room sobbing, scared out of my mind, and woke her up by saying, "Mom, there's something in the yard." She obviously didn't know what I meant, but she saw I was terrified. I ended up going back into my room to look out again, and I ended up seeing an empty yard instead. I slept in my mom's room the rest of the night, but I could not stop shaking. Even as a kid, I was never one to see imaginary things or be able to even visualize. And I know that what I saw was actually there. I went out the next morning and swear I saw prints on the ground where that thing was. I think the creepiest part, however, was a few days later. I had planned a sleepover with my best friend, and he had canceled on me because he was nervous since he had never slept over. The next day, he actually told me about a vivid dream he had. He had told me that he was in my room, looked out my window, and described the exact same thing I saw. But I had never told him because I thought I was crazy. To this day, we still speak about it, and neither of us has any explanation for it. I wonder if I saw a shadow person. Or maybe a skinwalker? It was definitely not human. Since then, I have had no other experience seeing something like that. I was wondering if anyone else had any similar stories as well. When I was about 13, I had a friend spend the night. We spent a good part of the night watching videos and telling scary stories before I offered to go make us some popcorn and some sweet tea. My house was relatively small, and the kitchen was conjoined with the dining room. My grandmother kept a large china plate display in the dining room, and through it, you could see the entire kitchen reflected in it. While I was pouring our tea, I glanced over at it, and in the reflection standing behind me, which didn't make sense as my grandmother kept her folded up treadmill in that spot, was the tallest woman I've ever seen with long black hair to match and no face. It scared me so bad that my legs gave out, and I screamed my friend's name. The house was dead silent, my dog didn't even come, so I scooped up the tea and popcorn and scrambled back to the bedroom. When I got in there, I was angry. She hadn't answered when I'd called out for her. I had a small house, and there was no way she didn't hear me, but she swore up and down that she didn't and was confused. When I explained what had happened and described the scary figure in the reflection, she broke down, I'm talking, sobbing, and kept saying, "It follows me everywhere." Needless to say, the subject was dropped, and I didn't invite her back over. I've never seen such a clear reflection like that since, and I'm just glad it went back home with her, whatever it was. The only time I ever had was when I lived on a Cree reserve in northern Alberta. My family is native, but not Cree, and this reserve has fairly recently, within the last 2 generations, been ripped apart by residential schools. My father was one of 7 RCMP officers in the area, so we were regarded with caution and often hated. About 3 months after moving there, we noticed the coyotes had stopped howling near our house. Shortly after that, we realized we had no animals near the house at all. No animal tracks, no birds, our family cat had disappeared. It was unsettling. Even the neighbor's border collie avoided our property. My parents invited the elders to visit for dinner and drinks. They were very friendly and informal. One of the Ketaya elders brought my mom sage and sweet grass. Sage is smudged to clear bad energy, and sweet grass is a peace of offering. The Ketaya didn't say a thing to us the entire meal, but near the end of the visit, she stood on the back step and watched the darkness. I went to offer her tea when she pointed to the darkness. They fight. They're unhappy. I could see what looked like jackals. They were built like greyhounds but the size of a Great Dane or wolfhound. They were pacing back and forth at the edge of our property line. They were angry. Kokum came back a few days later and sat us down. She told us that some families were upset. We weren't Cree, yet living in Kikino, which means our home. We were upsetting some less reputable people by enforcing laws of the government, not of the reserve. Reserves have a right to self-government to a degree, but they still fall under most laws. She told us that some of the people had set the Ibchini, I'm sure I have spelled this wrong, but it's similar to the Iroquois Wendigo, on our family. She spoke with the Ka-Peakaskanuik community/family, and they had come forward, apologetic. We smudged the property, and I haven't seen them since. I was around 5 to 7 years old, I'm 22 now, when this experience took place. It was one of the primary catalysts for my interest and inquiry into high strangeness phenomena. The place in which this experience took place was my childhood bedroom. It is a very small room with creaky wooden floorboards. The foot of the bed was facing a wall, which was adjacent to the door on the left. The head of the bed was about a couple of feet away from the opposite wall, with the window to the left of the bed on that same wall. I woke up one morning, presumably around 8 a.m. or so, and had this eerie feeling that someone was standing behind my bed in the narrow gap between the head of my bed and the wall. I turned around and was not prepared for what I was about to see. I saw a woman with pale blue or gray skin and black, tattered, messy, frizzy hair. She was smiling from ear to ear. The overall demeanor she gave off was as if she was getting some sort of sick pleasure from my fear as I saw her. She seemed menacing and of ill intent. Her teeth seemed like they were stained badly. She gave me the impression that she had some sort of disease or was ill. It was like seeing the face of a long-term meth addict, but worse. The one thing I won't forget about her appearance is her eyes. The smile was unnerving enough, but her eyes were wide and intense. I'd describe them as psychotic and hungry in appearance. She had her hands resting on the wooden frame of my bed. I didn't get a good look at the hands, though. I was frozen in fear, staring at her face. As soon as I saw her for a few moments, I woke up in my bed again. Phew, it was just a dream, was more or less what was going through my head. I checked behind my bed immediately, and as soon as I felt relief wash over me, I turned my head to the foot of my bed to see her again, smiling even wider and more menacingly. I woke up again. This time I felt super paranoid upon waking and woke up with my head at the foot of my bed. I somehow flipped around in my sleep. I saw her once more before waking up again. After this sequence of nightmares with this woman occurred a couple more times, I finally woke up and didn't see her. I was extremely paranoid and was almost flinching, expecting to see her again. It is important to note that these dreams, I suspect I was fainting, felt extremely real and lacked any distinguishing qualities that dreams typically have. The terror I felt was beyond anything I've felt in my life. The story doesn't end here, though. The nail in the coffin that convinced me it wasn't a dream is what happened next. The rest of the morning was fairly usual until I was getting ready to go to a dentist appointment with my mom. I was like 5 or 6. I was getting my shoes on when I glanced down the hallway to my room. The door was open, and standing in my room was the woman. This time, she just had a smug smirk on her face. I stood there shocked for a moment before I blinked, and she was gone. The thing is, I saw her crystal clear. Just as if I were looking at any other person. I told my mother, who just told me that it was my mind playing tricks. I never saw her again after that morning, which I remember anyway. I had a handful of other paranormal or high strangeness experiences when I was a child, but those were different from this type of event. I doubt any of my personal paranormal experiences were hauntings because none of my other family members had anything happen to them at the time. These strange events just isolated me for some reason. The strange thing is that if anyone were to ask me if I had any ghost stories up until a couple years ago, I would have said no. The main reason being that this memory was kind of absent from my mind for most of my life, strangely. I suppose this was a response to a traumatic event. Has anyone else experienced anything like this? One night, me and my brother were hanging out with a few of his friends. We were hanging out and then decided we wanted to meet up with another friend who was down the road. We knew it was already dark, but we figured that he was close enough to just walk. We used our phones as flashlights and talked about stupid stuff as we walked. Of course, the street we live on wasn't in the middle of nowhere, but it had a lot of trees and woods around. Oddly, we started to hear a lot of strange noises, like someone running in the woods and stuff, but we just figured it was an animal. We were about 40 feet away from our friend's house when my brother stopped dead in his tracks. He froze and told us he saw someone, so we all looked in the direction he was looking. There was a very tall man in the woods, just standing there. He tilted his head a bit, I guess checking us out, and then his body floated a few feet in the air and disappeared. Being terrified, we started running to our friend's house, almost breaking down the door and getting inside. To this day, we have no clue what we saw that night. I was in this forest that's part of a place called the Bridgewater Triangle, which is one of the most haunted areas in the United States. I was in a specific part of it called Profile Rock with 3 of my friends. We were out there late, it was about 2:30 to 3 a.m. at the time. We were on our way out, walking down this long, winding path to get back to our vehicle. Keep in mind that it was pitch black out pretty much, and we could only see the moon shining through the trees. I don't know why I turned around. I didn't hear anything, and I didn't feel like anything was following us, but I turned around and looked in the back of us, and I saw something running at us about 100 feet away. What scared me wasn't that something was running at us, it was how it was running at us. You know how a zombie walks in a horror film, like dragging its leg, almost limping? That's how this thing was running at us, like it broke its ankle or something. Initially, I thought it could be someone who got injured in the woods or something, until I saw this thing run past the moonlight. You know how a child draws a person as a stick figure? That's exactly how this thing looked. It had no facial features and no face, just a completely blank face like a stick figure, and its body looked the same from what I could see, no definition or anything. I called my friend, who was closest to me, and called out in a panicked voice. He glanced in the direction I was looking, which was now all moonlit, and I could tell by his facial expression that I wasn't seeing things. We both took off and started running. My other 2 friends were up ahead and shot around and asked us what's wrong, to which I replied, just ducking run. I didn't look back once until we were right near our car, and it was gone like it was never there, even though by then it would have certainly been on top of us. I'll never know exactly what the duck that was. Sometimes the unknown is better left unknown. My brother and I, aged 12 and 9, were in sleeping bags in a spare guest room of my aunt's. She had just moved in, and we were there to help unpack. It was well into the night, so we were asleep in the dark room. My eyes shot open because something was in the room. I didn't see it, but it felt like something was standing between my brother and me. Before I could think of what I should do next, it started shouting down at us. Guttering gibberish is loud and angry. I start screaming my head off. My aunt bursts in and yells what's going on, and my only response is to scream, turn on the ducking light. Nothing was there. It was quiet. My brother was curled up in a ball at the bottom of his sleeping bag. We went back to sleep, trying to convince myself that my brother had talked in his sleep or something. We never talk about it again. Fast forward, my brother is about to leave for Marine boot camp. Having a beer and just chatting. He asks me if he can bring up a random thing that's always bugged him, and he proceeds to tell me about his memory of that night. According to him, having never heard my version, he describes waking up to me screaming and something that seemed to be floating above us yelling at us in some weird language he had never heard before. He said he just wanted to get that off his chest before going off to war. Well, duck is pretty much the only thing I could respond with. Roughly around 1940, my grandmother was riding a horse with her uncle, heading to another village. They were riding in a rural, wooded area when a rabbit crossed their path. The horse panicked and stood up on its hind legs. The rabbit looked at them, grinned, and giggled something they couldn't understand because the horse was crazy nervous. He finally calmed down after the rabbit continued its path. My grandmother was the only child of a priest. She had always told this story about the time she met the devil. There is a similar thing that happened to the grandfather of a close friend. He was in the woods and saw a young goat, so he wanted to take it since it looked lost and couldn't survive long alone like that. The moment he took it in his arms, he said something cute to the little goat, and it looked at him and repeated the sentence with a mocking, sarcastic voice. Both happened in Macedonia. Any idea what these things are? Shadow person, at least that's the best way I can describe this thing that I encountered. So, a few years back, I went out with some friends to the mountains for a camping trip, and by camping, I mean everyone gets drunk or high around a fire in the middle of the woods and then passes out in their trucks. I was always the youngest of the friend group, and this took place before I found my taste for mind-altering substances. I'm typically something of a skeptic, and if this had happened nowadays, I'd probably blame it on being drunk, but I was stone cold sober the whole time, which is why I feel so sure of what I saw. We're all out at the campsite, maybe 10 to 15 of us. I'm sitting on someone's tailgate smoking a cigarette when my friend, let's call him John, comes up to me clearly intoxicated. John was the one I came out to the campsite with and probably my closest friend out of anyone there. He asked me if I wanted to go on an adventure with him in the woods. I figured that if nothing else, I should probably go with him just to make sure he didn't drunkenly fall over and hurt himself, not to mention that even though I didn't drink or do any drugs back then, that didn't mean I was opposed to fun adventures into the forest. So we walked past the tree line that surrounded the campfire and into the dense trees. The moon was out, and it was a pretty clear night, so although it was dark, it wasn't pitch black. We came to a clearing that seemed to be made up of many flattish boulders and rocks. We were looking up at the night sky, and John was drunk talking, and I was listening and nodding along with whatever nonsense he was saying. He sat down on one of the flatter rocks and eventually just laid down and passed out. I tried to jostle him awake, but he just kept mumbling for me to let him rest a while. Since this is usually how John behaves when he's drinking, I complied and figured I'd head back to the campsite and check on him again in a little bit. I go back, talk to a few people, smoke a few cigarettes, and then decide to go back and check on John. Maybe 10 minutes have passed. I'm walking back to the clearing where I left him, and I already noticed from afar that he wasn't in the spot where I left him. I kept going, figuring that he must have gotten up and wandered off somewhere. As I'm walking, I notice a shadow in the shape of a human standing behind a shrub of sorts a few feet to my right. I stop, figuring that it was John messing with me. I said, "Dude, come on, let's head back to camp," and there was no response. Then, the stereotypical "please, you're not scaring me." And still, nothing. I move closer to the shadow and notice that I can't make out any distinguishable features, no shirt logo, no eyes, or any face, for that matter. Just a vacuum of black stood in the shape of a human, hanging out with me in the forest. I backed away, putting it all together so that it wasn't John and I running back to camp. I checked the truck, and John and I drove out, and there he was sleeping on the bench seat. I did a quick head count, and everyone that I had recalled being at the camp was still there. The only thing that convinced me that this was paranormal was the sheer absence of light that this thing took the shape of. Just pure darkness. Whenever I tell this story, John always gets the chills, imagining that this thing was probably out there with him when he was passed out by himself. The general conclusion was that John had stumbled back while I had left him, and I just didn't notice that he had returned. Like I said, I'm a skeptic, so I always try to rationalize these things, but this is the one experience that I've had that I just can't believe was simply my eyes playing tricks on me. When I was a kid, our dog went missing one night. It was already dark, and a storm was coming. My parents decided we would grab some flashlights and go look for him. We drove down the road, parked off to the side, and just started calling his name. My sister and I walked into a big field, and a lady just appeared out of nowhere. She had a dress on, and she was holding an old lantern. She asked us what we were doing. We told them we were looking for our dog. She told us to get off her property. We started to walk away, and she just disappeared right in front of us. My sister and I knew we saw a ghost. We found out later that the field we were in was an old graveyard. Most of the tombstones were knocked over or broken. To this day, nobody believes us. We know what we saw that night. I'd never been a big fan of camping. In 2012, for some reason or another, my friend and I decided to take a Saturday night to camp on private property. We had permission from the owner, on the bank of a small lake in the rural American Southeast. The lake wasn't very large, probably only 50 to 150 yards across, not great at estimating distance. It was more of a deep pond, but it was 5x as long as it was wide, and, from the perspective of our camp, it consumed the majority of our sight line. The plot of land itself wasn't entirely removed from civilization. We were 5 to 10 miles outside of a small suburb of a mid-sized southern city. It definitely was not easy to access, however, and the only way in was a gated, narrow dirt road across a levee that spanned one side of the lake. This road was gated and locked. The owner gave us his code, we pulled the car through and locked the gate behind us. If you've ever been down south, you know how quickly it gets isolated outside of cities. Our cities are small, and the rural people around us often live rough and wild. We have dense woods, so thick that they're not worth building in unless you have some connection or attachment to the area. I've heard it was not profitable to cut roads through a lot of it when they were building highways in the 50s, so not much development has happened in the last 100 years, and in some places, since the Civil War. It's not uncommon to go for a 30-minute drive straight out of town and come upon cabins that are obviously off the grid. My friend and I were used to living in the suburbs, so we were just happy to see stars and hear the sounds of nature. We were at our very utilitarian camp, a small Coleman 2-person tent and a blanket, simply looking around and enjoying the night, when suddenly my buddy sat up real straight. He said something like, "Do you see that guy over there?" He pointed to the other side of the small lake. I didn't see anything. I sat up slightly and said, "Nah, it's just the dark playing tricks on you." He seemed actually shaken. "No, look. There's a bunch of faces behind the trees now." That got my attention, and I sat up fully, rubbing my eyes to try to gain full focus. And then I saw them. Small, round, white faces stared back at me from across the lake. Maybe 15 to 20 of them. All were positioned in such a way that their bodies were behind the trees and only their heads were visible. The best way I can describe the faces is like very pale, somehow internally illuminated children. I should mention that neither of us were drinking or high. We were too young for that, not for at least a few more years. We had eaten dinner at home and were just planning on going to sleep after chilling out for a while. The faces weren't moving. I was kind of sitting there in shock, thinking that my eyes would adjust and I would see that they were a reflection, bugs, owls, or something. But I would never come to that realization. I stared right back at them for what felt like 5 minutes, looked back, and then they were gone. Bodies of water carry sound extremely well, and we heard extensive shuffling from the other side of the lake and a couple of small branches snap. It's incredible what your ears pick up on during an otherwise silent night. My buddy was tearing up a little when he said, "What the hell were those?" And I didn't have a good answer. Neither of us slept particularly well. I definitely felt validated in my feelings about disliking camping. But what were we going to do? I tried to do some research on the internet but never found a phenomenon that could explain that. When I was around 10 years old, I would sleepwalk every single night. This lasted until I was around 14. I'd go to bed upstairs and wake up downstairs on the couch with my dog next to me. One time I woke up in our backyard, on a bench we had. On one particular night, when I was about 13, I had the strangest experience I can remember, which, judging from other stories, could be an encounter with a demon. I was laying in bed half asleep when I heard 3 of the faintest knocks on the front door downstairs. I don't know how I heard it, but my bedroom was at the front of the house, so maybe that's how I heard it. I think I looked at the clock, and it was around 3:15 a.m. when I got up. My dog followed me downstairs to the front door. I opened it and saw a little girl. She had to be around 5 or 6. She had bright blue eyes and brown hair that was really short. I couldn't make out many other details about her face. It was a really dark night. But the faint glow of the street lights seemed to make her eyes a bright shade of blue. I didn't recognize her from my school or from my neighborhood. I had never seen her before in my life. I remember being confused as to why she was at the door, but before I could say anything, she asked, "Can I come in?" As she asked, she stepped closer, almost into the house, and my dog saw her and started growling. A little about my dog for context: he was a rescue Springer Spaniel called Benji and the most gentle boy ever. He never barked or growled at anything unless he was trapped somewhere. The sanctuary we rescued him from said he was probably hit when he barked or growled, so that's why he never did. He would cry after he barked or growled because he was scared he'd get hit. He was an amazing, gentle boy who I miss so much. He snarled and growled at this girl and started backing up, like he was going to attack her. I had never seen Benji this angry, ever. All I remember saying to her is, "No, you can't come in. Sorry, but you're upsetting Benji." She said okay, and just turned around and walked away. I closed and locked the door, turned around, and Benji was wagging his tail. I looked out the curtains just a couple of seconds after closing the door and couldn't see her anywhere, like she just vanished. My house had views across a lot of the neighborhood, and there was nowhere she could have gone that fast that would be out of sight from the front window. After that night, Benji started sleeping with me, right by my bedroom door, as if to block me from sleeping and walking again. Even though he had his own bed in my room next to mine, he would sleep on the floor inside my room, in front of the door. I'm 26 now, but I still remember this encounter today. I don't know if it was a demon that night or what it was, but I feel like Benji protected me from something. It was a summer night back in 2015, and I was with my cousin and his girlfriend at the time outside in the pool. I went underwater, and when I came back up, my vision coincided with the head of the shadow figure that was looking at us from the bathroom window. Judging by the height, it was 7 to 8 feet tall. As soon as I noticed and said immediately, "Look at the shadow," to them, the shadow figure flew really fast through all the walls that were in between the bathroom and his parents' bedroom until it went outside to the woods. My cousin and his girlfriend looked at me but didn't react to what I said, and the night continued normally. Later, I found out that my cousin's girlfriend's parents were into Santa Maria, and he told me he saw those figures until he broke up with her a year later. Over 10 years ago, I was in a bad place mentally. I am a firm believer in the occult and believe in a higher power, ghosts, and the supernatural. At the time, I had collected a few Ouija boards and was really into trying to speak to the dead. After several months of feeling like I was a medium, I was starting to feel off. I was having horrendous thoughts that were very out of character for me. It got so bad that my hands were bleeding because I could not stop washing them. The guilt I felt from these thoughts was taking me over, and I thought I was going insane. It was around this point that I knew I needed to have a conversation with my mom about what was happening. So I told her everything, and she told me I needed to see a doctor. I began researching OCD and the effects of it. A week or so after confiding in my mom, I went and saw our family doctor. At 16, I was terrified of the idea of being mentally ill. I nervously told the doctor everything that I had been feeling, and he filled out a prescription for Prozac and recommended I see a doctor. I take the papers he gives me and shrug them off. I tell my mom what he said and start to plan my road to recovery. A few days later, while researching some stuff about Ouija boards and trying to take my mind off of things, I came across an article about something called demonic oppression. Holy duck. This was me. This was the definition of what was happening to me. My symptoms were all on par with what the article was referencing. Basically, it is the idea of not being possessed and having a demon in you, but the idea of someone being around you and trying to bring you down as much as possible. It can lead to demonic possession. The number one route is believed to entice negative energy to harass you. Playing with Ouija boards. I then began researching how to get rid of this hypothetical oppression. Get rid of your boards, and make sure to dispose of them correctly. I began to do so. Breaking the board and separating the pieces, making sure the pieces never touch when disposed of, and separating the planchettes as well. I put it all in separate bags, and it sat in our garbage for a day or so. Garbage day rolls around, and I hear the truck outside around the corner making its stops. Shit. I forgot I had kitty litter stuff to throw out, so I ran down the stairs and headed to the front door. My dad stops me at the bottom of the stairs and proceeds to mock me for having to clean up cat shit. I ignored him, not making eye contact, as he was annoying me and full on laughing at me at this point. I dart past and throw the shit into our bin to see the Ouija board bags being put into the garbage truck. When I enter the house, it's quiet. I yell to my dad, and no one answers. 15 seconds go by, and my mom comes in from work. She says hi, and I ask where dad went. She tells me he hasn't been home yet from work and that he had to pick something up from the grocery store. I tell her he must have forgotten to stop on the way home because I just spoke to him in person, like 2 minutes ago. She said that's impossible because she was just talking to him on the phone. I run to the phone and call him. Sure enough, he's still at A&P, and he is totally confused by what I am talking about. I hang up in complete shock. No one else was home, and it 100% looked and sounded like my dad. I know that was the last hooray for the thing that so much enjoyed making me feel like the devil's toilet paper. After the boards were taken away, all my symptoms stopped. Like overnight stopped. I am scared to think of what I might have seen had I looked my father in the eyes that day. Not the most terrifying experience I've had, but a group of 5 of my teenage friends and myself saw a lady walking up a country road one day. We were all stuffed in a little car, but it's a rural area of KY, and this was in the early 90s, so we stopped to ask her if she was okay. This lady was solid until we pulled up to her, and it was almost like she was flickering in and out of this plane of existence. You could see the trees behind her, and she was dressed in the typical working clothes of a farmer's wife from the 1900s, an apron and printed dress, hair and a plain scarf. The kid closest to the window in the back seat practically squashed me, trying to put distance between themselves and the apparition, but we honestly didn't want to be rude, even to a ghost. She asked us if we had seen Thomas, who apparently was her son and had walked to town for milk. The town was at least 15 miles away. The older kid driving offered her a ride even though there was no room, and she said no, didn't want to be a bother, and Thomas should be back shortly, but thanked us for the offer. The whole time, she's flickering between see-through and solid. We parted ways, and the boy up front in the passenger seat was panicked. He kept saying, "She was invisible," over and over. Everyone in the back seat is crying. We couldn't believe we saw that in broad daylight. Once we get back to town, no sign of Thomas on the way, we go to the park to collect ourselves. I was mad at the driver for stopping and wanted to know why the hell he would have offered a ride to a ghost. He said an old-timer had told him a story about a lady asking for rides on the road, and if you refused her, you would wreck and die in the next curve, so he offered her a ride. We were so disturbed by this whole thing that none of us spoke about it again for 10 years outside of an occasional "did that happen?" That's probably the 5th most terrifying experience I've ever had, but it's valid because there were so many of us. I don't even want to mention the other stuff because I don't want to invite anything. I grew up in an airy rural part of Alaska. One of my close friends lived out a ways and, because her mother was a bartender and bars didn't close until like 4 a.m., was alone a lot. Her trailer was absolutely shitty, the foundation had sunk, the pipes froze up and didn't work, and the heater couldn't keep up with an Alaskan winter, and the windows always iced over on the inside. We were maybe 14, and one of Nikki's boyfriends brought over the Ouija board and dared us all to use it. Most of our friends were too cool to admit they were scared, but I was a mega chicken. I never even did Bloody Mary, I was too afraid. They all settled in to play with the board, and I went to the little back room where their rabbits, they raised them for fur and meat, lived to read a book. It wasn't exactly warm, but it wasn't cold either, and Nikki's sister also came, so it was just the two of us and the bunnies. Every now and again, we'd hear a shriek from the living room, but for the most part, nobody bothered us, so we were fine. At least, until Nikki came out to see us with the Ouija board. She pulled out one of the smaller rabbits and, while laughing hysterically, put it on the board. It sat still for a few seconds, and then it rolled over, and it just died. Bunnies do that, get boulders along the tree line. There is also a large mound of dirt from the foundation of the home in the woods. My youngest brother walks with a limp and is rather short and pudgy at this time. This is all slightly important. I was about 12 years old when it started. My two brothers, Jerry and Joe, their friend, Nate, and I, Op, were playing hide and seek around the house. The entire property was fair game, woods included. My youngest brother, Joe, was it, and me and the other two boys hid behind the dirt mound. We waited there for 15 minutes and started getting worried because he never came looking for us. I remember volunteering to find him, and I ran all around the property but never did find him. I went inside, and he was playing a board game with some other friends. Okay, no big deal. I asked an adult how long he had been inside, and they said 30 minutes. I ran back outside to tell the others. When I got to the hiding spot, they were laughing. They asked how I got away from Joe. I told them that he had been inside the entire time. They stopped laughing and looked at each other. I asked what was going on. It turns out they saw what they thought was Joe running behind me in the woods, and as I reached the rocks, he just disappeared. We saw him around a lot but kind of ignored it, chalked it up to kids' imaginations, and played in the woods in groups. A few years later, we had another friend over who had never been at my house. We were all playing inside when he came in the room and asked why Joe was playing in the woods alone. We explained that Joe was at a friend's house, and there was no way it was him. He insisted that it was. We asked who told him about the man, and he had no idea what we were talking about. It still creeps me out. While stationed in Germany in the early 2000s, me and a group of friends decided to play the Ouija board in our military dorm rooms. Only 4 of us actually played, while a couple more people drank and watched us. After a couple minutes of us joking around, we started asking more serious questions. We eventually got in contact with a teen girl who told us she was looking for her boyfriend. She said that they were driving back from a Grateful Dead concert when they crashed their car and died, and she hasn't seen him since. The road they crashed on was one we knew well. It connected 2 Air Force bases and was pretty curvy and dangerous, and a lot of people had crashed and died driving it. After a couple minutes of small talk, she told us she had to leave but asked us if we could please find her boyfriend for her and gave us his name. I forgot it over the years. We eventually were able to make contact with him, and when we asked him if he knew Cheryl, the girl's name, he said yes. She was his true love, and he regretted not being able to be with her and missed her very much. He told us to tell her that he'd always love her and that he was sorry. When we asked him what he was sorry about, he just spelled out random letters until he eventually stopped communicating with us. After around 10 minutes of unsuccessfully trying to get in touch with Cheryl and her boyfriend again, we finally got in contact with an older woman. She seemed really sweet and nice, and she said she knew Cheryl. When we asked her why she was unable to find her boyfriend, she said it was because Cheryl was in heaven and her boyfriend was in hell. It was at that moment that the candles in the room flickered out, and we all jumped up and turned the lights on. Needless to say, everyone got pretty freaked out and decided to stop playing, and we never really talked about it after that. It's been over 10 years, and it still freaks me out thinking about that night. I live in the woods in a tent in Michigan. Yes, it's getting quite cold, but there are not too many options available to me at present. Well, often at night, I hear the sound of footsteps. Mostly raccoons and deer. A few weeks ago, I was hearing noises as usual, but it was early morning, and the sunlight gave me courage enough to unzip the tent and take a peek. I saw a black shadow of human form kind of hunched over, moving silently through the woods. It appeared briefly in my line of sight before being obscured by the brush. At this moment, I assumed it was the silence of a person and nothing more. Admittedly, I did find it somewhat odd that I could make out absolutely no characteristics. Anyway, I then made a movement, which created a lot of noise. All of a sudden, like 4 deer not 20 feet from me, they sprang out and ran in all directions. They had been so perfectly hidden and camouflaged in plain sight that I was somewhat in awe. Immediately after the deer dispersed, I saw the shadow form again. It shot across my field of vision, from where it had presumably been obscured. From right to left, the rate of speed at which it ran was amazing. It was faster than the deer, appearing to almost fly across my vision rather than run. It was literally gone in the blink of an eye. The other curious thing is that despite being in daylight, even when it was clearly in sight, it still remained just a solid black shadow. I have heard other reports of similar encounters. Needless to say, I no longer believe what I saw was a person. The spirit of the woods, perhaps? I just thought I would share. Beside that, nothing strange thus far. Anyway, when I was around 13 or so, I and my friend Matt had a strange encounter. My mom had bought a gargoyle and told us all not to mess with it and remove the chain. Of course, as kids, it's what we do, so we take the chain off and poke fun at it. Anyway, Mr. and my friends play all day and come at night. Me and Matt go watch TV. We're up all night watching Skinwalker until about 1 or 2 in the morning. I drop the remote, and in the process of grabbing it, I hit the power button on the direct TV box, and the TV went to static loud, like really loud. It scared us, and I hit the off button to kill the noise. I gave a nervous laugh, thinking we just avoided getting yelled at by my grandma and grandpa. Something mimicked my laugh, but not in the way I've ever heard of it. This was pure evil and sent me and Matt crying, running into my room. We cried all night. I can still hear it when I think back, and it's been years. I'm 34 now. Has anyone ever experienced anything like this? A few years ago, I had an odd experience or encounter with a shadow dog. I'm almost positive it wasn't a real dog at all, but some sort of paranormal encounter or warning. At the time, I was living with my ex-fiancée, who was working out of town at the time. My parents and sister lived about 5 minutes away, so I would frequently spend the day there and return home at night, usually around midnight. The house my fiancé and I were renting was just your basic modular home, with a covered porch. It's a little set back from the road. We lived in a little lake community, so I had neighbors, but they're mostly elderly and retirees, so it's usually quiet after 9 p.m. There's one street light, and it happened to be in my yard, but it wasn't particularly bright or useful. I got home, got out of my car, and immediately went to cross the street to check the mail before going inside. It's not a long walk, but it takes a couple of minutes. I get onto the road, and about halfway across, I get the most intense feeling of being watched. I'm pretty sensitive but not particularly paranoid, so it struck me how overwhelming it was. As soon as I felt it, I looked to my right, and there in the middle of the road, a few yards away from and just out of the reach of the light, is the shadowy shape of a dog. Now, I knew every single dog in that neighborhood and outside of the community. Neighbors are few and far between. Instinctively, I knew I didn't know this dog, so I panicked briefly because no one wants to get attacked by a strange dog, and I would lose the chase back to my house if I tried. The longer I stood there, though, the weirder it got. The shadowy dog was unnaturally still. It didn't move at all while I looked at it, not even an ear twitch. And even though it was dark out, it wasn't too dark out. I knew I should have been able to make out at least a few details of it, but I couldn't. It was almost just the dark shape of a dog, but I knew it was looking right at me. I decided that since I was practically at my mailbox, I would continue and get my mail anyway and calmly walk back to the house while keeping my eye on the dog just in case. And that's where it got even more unusual. As I moved, its head turned to follow me but nothing else. It was still unnatural, other than the obvious head movement. The light never caught its eyes either. It turned its head to follow me to the mailbox and followed me with its head all the way to my porch and into my house. As soon as I shut the screen door, locked the latch on it, and turned to look out at the dog, it looked in my direction for just a moment, then turned around and walked back in the other direction into the darkness. I had a feeling that I needed to lock all of my doors that night. I normally left the back door unlocked because you'd have to do a little work to get over the fence, plus we had a dog of our own, so I did. After getting inside, I just kind of had a feeling the shadow dog I saw wasn't really a threat, or even an actual dog, but maybe some kind of warning? It's definitely been one of my weirder experiences, and still to this day, I can't explain it. My buddy Roger had a basement. At the foot of the basement stairs was a door. This door closed off the basement, pool, and dart room from the rest of the house. The only problem is that after so many years, the door swelled up and would no longer close. Trying to close the door was a task. It had swelled so much that the flooring had been gouged out from the door scraping so hard. Now for the story. Roger, myself, and 2 other friends are playing around with the board in the dark. After about 15 minutes of goofing off, Roger's mother calls him up for dinner. He doesn't go. More shenanigans ensue for maybe 5 to 10 more minutes. Roger's mother gets heated. We can now hear her stomping across the house above us. She gets to the stairwell and screams, "Roger, get your ass up here for dinner right now." Roger responds, Okay, give me 2 more minutes." Mother responds, "Don't just stand there at the foot of the stairs, get up here." Now here's the problem, we are roughly 15 to 20 feet from the door. There's no way she sees Roger. Roger exclaims, "We are sitting at the bar," and the moment the word bar leaves Roger's mouth, the door that nobody could close slams shut with a purpose. The 4 of us immediately went from joking around to screaming and panicking as we couldn't open the door. Roger's dad jumped in through the basement window well and had to kick the door through to open it. I never went back to Roger's house. My folks and I lived right at the edge of a fairly big national forest. The back 4 acres or so of our property was fenced in so the dogs could run, but they constantly found ways out, and we had to patch holes or fill in digs. This had gone on for months and was just a part of life now. One night I was getting home fairly late, and, as I got out of my car, my pappy hollered from somewhere in the woods along the fence, "Hey! Since you're home, can you come give me a hand?" The person I was on the phone with heard him and said they'd let me go since it sounded like I had a fence to fix. I hollered back that I was going to set my stuff in the house and I'd be right there. When I opened the door to set my stuff down, Pappy was sound asleep in the recliner in the living room. As soon as I saw him, every hair on me stood on end. I practically dove inside, shut the door, and slammed the deadbolt home like I was trying to drive it into the door frame. I don't know what was calling me from the woods, but I know it definitely wasn't my dad. One night, a friend of mine who was dating my sister at the time had janitorial duties at the church, and I convinced him to let me and my girlfriend, now wife, into the church with some equipment. Me and my girlfriend went into the church, and immediately there was a rotten smell. I turned around and asked if everyone else smelled it, and all of a sudden it sounded like someone was running towards us on top of the pews. They were cracking loudly, one by one, from the front of the church towards the back, where we were standing. The other people I was with ran out. I stayed and took some pictures. My friend got a phone call and told me we had to leave immediately. While we were in the church, my sister was across town, sitting for a friend. Their dog started acting growly and showing its teeth, and she started hearing voices in the house. We were closing up the church, and the doors started swinging open and closing on their own with us. My friend and I had to push with all of our weight behind them to keep the doors still so that we could lock the doors. We left and went to where my sister was, and she was standing outside waiting for us and wouldn't go back into the house. I went to collect her belongings and set up an audio recorder on the table. When we listened back, there was a distinct voice that sounded like a little girl saying, "Go away." So my man and I shared an apartment for a while, and it seemed pretty normal. After a while, things became hectic in the relationship, and I moved out. We were broken up for about 9 months or so before I moved back in and worked things out. During my time away, he told me he had 2 friends who would move in and stay temporarily. Cool. Here's where it gets weird. Once I moved back in, the comfort in the apartment wasn't the same. I felt like I was being watched. Walking past the bathroom was highly uncomfortable, and I swore I would see shadows dancing in the hall while I sat in the living room. I would shut the bedroom doors to both bedrooms, thinking that maybe it was the light from outside reflecting the shadows of the trees into the hall, trying debunking, but no, sir, it continued. I brushed it off for a while and thought my imagination had gotten the best of me, until one night. We were in our bedroom, and I was sitting on the edge of the bed. We were in the process of becoming intimate. I looked over his shoulder, and in the hall, I saw a pitch-black shadow of a child run from the front of the apartment into the bedroom down the hall. I shot up and went into the bedroom, and what do you know? There is no one there. I told him about it, and he simply said it was my imagination. He doesn't believe in things of a paranormal nature. A few days later, his daughter was dropped off. She played in the other bedroom. She got quiet and then came into the living room, where we sat and proceeded to ask him, "Daddy, whose baby was that in the hallway?" At this point, I was kind of happy but confused. I was happy because I wasn't the only one. I was confused because I saw a child, not a baby. Yet once again, he ignored it and said it was just us, but then. We often sat together in the living room, watching movies. One day we heard noises, and I told him there was something wrong, something was in the apartment, and to my satisfaction, he experienced it. He saw a man, also a dark shadow, just like the baby and the child. The door to his daughter's room opened, and then it closed. She was not there this time, she was with her mother. The door handle jiggled until he got to the door, and then it stopped. This shadow would peek around corners, stand in the hall and watch us, and just frightened the hell out of me. He apologized for not believing. He was a lifelong skeptic who had been proven wrong. He told his friend that he had lived there for some time before I moved back. His friend casually said, "Oh, things like that have followed me around since childhood. I guess I left one behind." I became angry. I think some things should be shared with someone when you move into their home, you know? I snore. I sleepwalk. Casper is my first cousin, and we're pretty close. Things of that nature. We moved. Lol, but I'm still confused. Like, was it a baby, a child, or a man? Did it appear to us in different forms? Was it actually 3 and not 1? Ike. But in our new place, we get the feeling we haven't moved here alone, so is it now attached to us? I have so many questions. Shadow Man. This is one of the more recent paranormal encounters that I have experienced in recent years. Okay, so I and my family live out in the woods, a little bit off of the main road. I often have a habit of walking down the driveway at night for that cold night air because I find it soothing. Anyway, we have a storage building on the right side of our house, and the door to it is always closed. I was preparing to walk back when I noticed, from a distance, that the storage building's light was on and the door was open. Oh boy, I thought, did I leave it open? But I hadn't gone anywhere near it. I look more closely, and I very clearly see what looks like the black silhouette of a man, facing perfectly in my direction. Note that this silhouette or shadow figure is standing in a brightly lit room inside the storage building. It was very easily visible and very clear to make out. I stared at it for several minutes, and it didn't move or disappear. So I walked back down the driveway into the storage building. The door was still wide open, and the light was still on, but the shadow figure had completely vanished by the time I arrived. I went to the same spot where I saw it standing and looked to see if something may have been leaning against or hanging on the wall to make it appear to look like something was standing there. But nope, nothing. There was nothing on the wall, no objects in that whole section of the area where the shadow figure had stood. There were also no shadows being cast in the spot where the figure stood, either. This happened last month, some time ago, if I recall. I know it was fairly recent, no more than a month and a half or so ago, and I firmly believe that what I saw was a shadow figure. No one came outside the entire time, I was the only one out there. Like I said, we live in the woods, just off the side of the road. You'd have to be crazy to be a stranger walking there in the dark at night with no street lights. And as a side note, regarding this area and our woods specifically, me and much of my immediate family here believe it to be haunted. It isn't uncommon to have a paranormal experience here, and many of us had them in this area growing up as kids. I've always been fascinated by the occult. I visited a few psychics in my youth, read my horoscope, and believed in the concept of a spirit world, but all of it fell under the umbrella of proceed with caution due to my Protestant upbringing. As an adult, I found that evangelical Christianity only worked in the sense that I felt taken care of spiritually, but taken care of by a schoolmaster, constantly being reminded of my shortcomings. But I know there's power in the Bible, and I know there are greater forces influencing us. We indeed wrestle, not against flesh and blood. Therefore, I couldn't simply turn off my spiritual awareness. I followed my intuition and was eventually led to meditation, specifically meditating while listening to sound frequencies meant to lift your vibrations and ease anxiety. I was surprised to find how well it worked and began a month's worth of research leading me through the Hermetic principles and being introduced to Hemi-Sync via the Gateway Project. In the last couple of months, I've tuned into what's happening around me and have had several personal experiences with what I believe are spiritual guides advising me. They communicate through coincidences that occur when I've had a string of good meditation sessions. These guides are benevolent and constant. They're meant to be. For the first time today, however, I encountered an evil entity in my house. My mother-in-law has been staying with us, and she and I have been at odds. The details aren't important, but we have been avoiding each other. I couldn't stand to be near her room, as I felt such negative energy there. I assumed it was me, just not being able to forgive her, projecting my problems onto that energy. But we both forgave each other in words and genuinely wanted to move on, but we couldn't. We both ruminated on it. Fast forward to 3 days ago, and I found a homemade Ouija board in my stepdaughter's room. I didn't think much of it but felt prompted to tell my husband about it this morning, to which he agreed he didn't like it but had chosen not to take it seriously. Later in the day, my stepdaughter's mom was here, dropping her off, and pulled us aside, telling us we should keep an eye on her because she found another homemade Ouija board at her house, and her other daughter had started having nightmares about a demon chasing her, accompanied by sleepwalking. I had chills. I knew instantly that we had an evil entity in the house. I realized this entity had been influencing my feelings toward my mother-in-law. Strangely, I'd have days where I didn't think of her at all and felt at peace, only to encounter her depressed. Then I'd have days I couldn't stop ruminating about how I didn't like her, and she would be in the best mood. My theory is that the entity bounces between the two of us, feeding on our energy like a parasite. My husband burned sage through the house as my mother-in-law, and I told whatever was here to leave. And that's when I felt it. Goosebumps, chills, and a sort of static pressure are confronting me. I began to cry. I told it to leave, it wasn't welcome here. My mother-in-law called me to her room, and I could tell the entity had been there a while. It was feeding on her energy. The walls oozed with their presence. I commanded it to leave, feeling the pressure shift. It was scary. They fear the living when they're found out. I talked to it as if I were scolding a child. It knows it has to go. My mother-in-law and I both had chills, and here I am talking to the ceiling, and she's looking at me with complete trust and belief. We hugged for a solid minute after. My grudge toward her seems to be gone. The energy in her room is much lighter. We've had a discussion with my stepdaughter about the boards. She seems to be taking what happened seriously. I feel empowered and more sure than ever that the spirit realm not only exists but influences our day-to-day lives so subtly that we won't realize it unless we're keen on these kinds of things. So don't let anyone tell you this stuff doesn't exist. I'm as logical and analytical as they come, and I know what I experienced today. Don't just believe in it, friends. Know the nature of what you're dealing with, and take action if necessary. My friend and I encountered a demon in the woods outside our houses. So me and my friend were about 9 and were walking around the woods one winter. It was quite warm for a winter day, but everyone was at home, so nobody else was near. We were talking and messing around, as you do when you're that age, but then we heard a sound. It sounds like a bird taking flight. We both heard it but thought nothing of it. Around 5 minutes later, we heard it again but still thought nothing of it. We then saw something move in front of us. I can't quite describe it as my mind has seemingly blocked it out, but it was hairy, like a fox, and had black leathery wings. My friend started to back away, but I, the more careless one of us, walked up to it. I then remember it taking flight again, but in my direction. The next thing I know, me and my friend are on the floor, around 5 meters away from where we were. Our heads were bleeding around our ears. We then went home, but, being 9 years old, we were unable to convince our parents of what happened. We both agreed to never talk about it again. The scary thing? I live only 10 meters away from the woods and still explore, as I have a feeling of power there, as if I could do anything. Every time I leave, I feel movement behind me. I never look. Ever. I encountered a few negative entities or evil spirits. One I encountered was latched to my now ex. Before we dated, she told me she had an entity attached to her that would make stuffed animals contort, so she burned them just out of pure terror. Eventually, when my ex and I began to date, it started revealing itself to me. It would tell me its name is Cardin. Soon after that, it started telling me that it wanted to marry me, kill me, and live together after death. And that the only reason for tormenting my ex was because her pain pleasured it. Another time, I had some entity appear when I was home alone, going to bed. I felt something was around, and I felt uneasy. I typically feel like my chest has an extremely heavy weight on it when an oppressive entity is around. And I started to hear something scraping on the hardwood floors and something walking outside my room. I kind of just ignored it and eventually saw a totally gray creature with 3 fly-like eyes and a mouth full of razor-sharp teeth just smiling at me, sitting at the end of the bed. This particular entity was interesting. After that day, it then latched onto my ex, seeing as it couldn't really affect me otherwise. But it was communicated through a third party. It messaged me through her Discord account, which was new. My friends who are witches and work in this field were dumbfounded by it but agreed it was the spirit. It was, however, the dumbest spirit I've ever met. It attempted to be frightening and always called me a BTCH. So I dubbed it Bitch Spirit. It would often lash out because I made fun of it so often. Haunted Ouija Board Stories. Story 1, Haunted Garage. I moved in with my sister and her ex in a little renovated garage unit made into a living room/kitchen area with 1 bed and a bath. In Berea, Kentucky. She told me it was haunted. She would hear footsteps and noises coming from the living room when no one was home but her. From the get-go, that place felt off. Everyone always got the heavy feeling of being watched. Everywhere else but the bedroom. Including the bathroom. They only used the bedroom and the facilities when necessary, so there was no furniture in the living room. So when the neighbor gave me a couple wooden chairs, I brought them over to the house. My sister didn't want them there. But I still just sat them against the wall and went about my day. Well, the next time I went into the living room, one of the chairs had been moved to the middle of the floor, underneath the ceiling fan. I asked if anyone moved it, and she mouthed off, "I don't even want them here. Why would I fool with them?" So I just placed them back against the wall. And the next time I went in there, it happened again. We had heard rumors about a man hanging himself in there. And I suppose that just about sums it up. Also, one night my sister had her friend Matilda over, and we were all sitting on the bed in a triangle. Her friend and I are at the foot of the bed. We were just talking when I saw a quarter-sized black orb float from in front of the wall, up over top of the blinds, and then disappear. The blinds were closed, and it was nighttime. So it wasn't a headlight or anything. I stopped talking and said, "I just saw something." And Matilda said she did too and elaborated exactly what I saw. Story number 2, the soaring pan. I was spending the night with my friend Raspberry at her brother Michael's house. Their other brother, Spalding, her boyfriend, Barney, and 2 cats were also there. It was around 11 p.m. when she broke out her glow-in-the-dark Ouija board with the light-up planchette. All of us, including the cats, head upstairs and into the closet, leaving no one or nothing to debunk our experience. We were all very serious about playing it. And I wouldn't have goofed off. So we sit down and light a few candles. And begin asking if there's anyone there who would like to speak to us. We get a yes and all look at each other. We play by asking random questions. And I remember the last question being, "Are you in the house?" "No." It reads, and then immediately after that, we hear a bang. Downstairs. We do a half-assed goodbye by pushing it ourselves and burst out of the closet and down the stairs. To find that the pan we had used to make biscuits earlier, and obviously left out on top of the stove, had been completely thrown across the room. Into the living room. It is safe to say our adrenaline was pumping for a while that night. It was incredible. Story 3, non-human. Later that night, it was just Michael and I playing another round on the Ouija board, and we asked the spirit, "Are you human?" It said no. And then there's scratching on the closet door. Then he banged and scratched as if something was trying to get in. Like I said, we were all very serious about it and wouldn't have messed around. Besides, someone always fesses up to it at some point when they do play a prank like that. No one ever did. We left the closet to find rather deep claw marks on it. And that was the last time we played. I was standing with my older brother, both of us smoking cigarettes, outside on my parents' porch. My family and I grew up in a very superstitious part of the American Southwest. I guess you could say that in a part of America where there is a very strong fear of skinwalkers. I know, another skinwalker story, but what I witnessed alongside my brother felt chillingly real. A few years before this incident, my older brother and I encountered something in our parents' backyard, so we've always been a bit on edge at night around our neighborhood, and still are to this day. That, and we grew up in a culture that discourages people from wandering around at night without some sort of cultural blessing. But we were a few years older, smoking our cigarettes, catching up because my brother was attending college in the city, and I was finishing up my junior year in high school. I was rambling on about something when I saw my brother's startled look out at our neighbor's yard. I looked over at what he was staring at and found myself looking at a shadow figure standing outside our neighbor's house. And it's hard to describe this shadow as its figure was basically blacker than the night outside the dim glow of the street lights, having an almost shadowy radiance if that makes any sense. It was standing on the side of our neighbor's house, and while I couldn't see its face, I knew it was staring at our neighbor's draped windows. My brother and I looked at each other with disbelief. We'd both hear the stories about skinwalkers roaming around at night. I mean, we both witnessed that sort of thing years ago, but it was only a glimpse followed by hearing the most otherworldly, horrifying howl that sounded both human and animal. But this was different. It was like seeing something we were never meant to see. Something even more sinister. We said nothing to each other, turning our gaze back towards the figure, who was still staring at the neighbor's window. After what seemed like a long moment, the figure started to slowly turn and walk to our neighbor's backyard. But the way it moved was a surreal sight. It looked to be moving both slowly and quickly at the same time. Like jogging in place, except it was gliding along. Then it moved towards a group of neighborhood dogs. And I knew these were neighborhood dogs because I recognized almost every one of them under the dim tangerine backyard light, but they weren't scared by the shadow figure. In fact, they looked to be welcoming it. The dogs formed a crowd around the figure, which stopped and, I swear to this day, morphed down onto all fours, sprang a black tail, and disappeared into the night with the group of neighborhood dogs following. I looked to my brother and asked, "What did you put into these cigarettes?" We both nervously chuckled, but we knew what we saw and hurried back inside, making sure we took our cigarette butts with us. Inside, our dad and youngest brother were asleep, but our mom was still up. We told our mom what happened, and she instructed us to go outside to get some wood to burn. She smeared ash on our foreheads, and we ventured outside to gather some firewood. While walking towards the woodpile, we noticed that our street light, which was on when we were heading back inside after stamping out our cigarettes, was out, the only street light out in the entire neighborhood. We saw it as a sign of something being around and hurried to gather the woods. Right when we were about to head inside, we could smell it, the strong, putrid scent of a dead animal. We knew right there and then that we were in the middle of all those stories we'd hear about skinwalkers. We didn't stop to take a look around. Instead, we made haste back into our house and built a fire. We told our mom what we smelled outside, and she marched outside with a fresh tin of ash to confront whatever was out there. She yelled in English and her native language, "Leave us the duck alone, we never did anything to you," and commanded for it to leave by the traditional ways and the way of Jesus Christ. She sprinkled ash outside our front and back porches and anchored a bow and arrow above the door leading out towards the back porch. We slept that night without any incidents. Months later, when I moved to the city to live with my older brother and work for the summer, I got a call from our mom. She told me that the neighbor, who lived in the house that the shadow figure was outside of, died of cancer. Whatever we saw that night still chills me to this day. My best friend's family used to play with one all of the time, but because of some of the things that happened, she's never touched one. Her sister first started to use one when my friend was an infant. Strange things happened at that house. Her sister looked outside of the window one day, and this was in the middle of the day, and saw a black family, dressed in clothes from maybe the end of the 19th century or the beginning of the 20th century, staring back at her. Another time, my friend's family heard my friend open my friend's bedroom door, and close it. He assumed it was her, but he freaked out when he actually heard her voice the second time, meaning that the first instance wasn't her. This was a regular occurrence. I'm not sure of the authenticity of this next story because it does sound fishy, and I don't blame you if you don't believe it. But her sister is not very intelligent. She spent 2 years in high school before she dropped out and had only earned a gym credit, so I don't know how or why she would lie about this. Anyway, her sister said that she was playing with the board one day, and when she asked who she was speaking to, she got a weird name. It struck her as odd, but she didn't really worry about it. Weeks later, she watched a special on the History Channel or something. They were discussing demonology. She recognized one of the names as being the strange one she had encountered through the Ouija board. This was a long time ago, so my friend and I can't remember the exact name. All we can remember is that it, supposedly, resembles a ram and that we were able to find information on it on the interwebs. Oh, and her sister is sensitive? For several years now, every time she has a dream about a dying bird, that means something bad is going to happen to her family within the next few days. Every time she told them about it, someone died, got really injured, got really sick, etc. I'm sure that her sensitivity makes using a Ouija board a different experience. This actually happened to me about 2 weeks ago. 2 good friends of mine who live in a different state decided to come visit me on a whim. We bought some good time supplies, and one night, really late, we had all sobered up and found ourselves with nothing to do. One of my friends, we'll call her Alex, and I had already messed with a Ouija board on a few occasions. We both know a lot about them and managed to rally up the hopes of our respective boyfriends. Let's get scared. Let's just freak ourselves out. Neither of the men were true believers, so we figured, why not? Something to do. So we made a Ouija board. Nobody ever tells you that playing with a Ouija board is a good, safe, or fun thing to do. Ever. Prior to this night, I did actually think they were fun. But quickly, I understood why so many people had warned me of the board. For the first 10 or 15 minutes, it was mostly us just asking questions to empty the air. Then Alex suggested that we turn out the lights. We lit candles, turned the radio on to white noise, and let the room get dark. That's when things started to get weird. The planchette, before we could even ask if there was anything there, moved very quickly to say hello. To which I asked, "Who are you?" The static noise from the radio stopped. It was dead silent. The planchette spelled out, very quickly, Zozo. I can't specifically remember all of the questions we asked, but I remember some of the answers. It told us to get help, and when we asked for whom, it spelled out white cat. That's my big kitty, Sly Pooper, and the next day he was limping with a hurt rear leg. He was fine the day before. I don't know what happened. When we asked Zozo to give us a sign of his presence, he spelled out stop. Around that time, we started to hear weird screeching noises coming from the radio, but I figured it was just interference and turned it off. Then half of the things on top of my fridge fell to the floor. A bag of bananas, a container of garlic cloves, a glass dish, and a bag of onions crashed onto the floor in a big heap, and before I could even react, half of the candles blew out, too. We acknowledged Zozo out loud and thanked him. I have lived in this apartment for 10 months, and I've never seen anything like that happen. I was freaked out. It was getting real. We decided to ask Zozo to leave, and he told us no. We decided to tell it to leave. The planchette kept going back from hello to no. It did this 7 or 8 times. My 2 friends took their fingers off the planchette. They were scared. My boyfriend and I were the only ones with fingers on it. I was the designated medium, but out of nowhere, my boyfriend demanded Zozo leave because he was not welcome in our home. My brain was like, what a bad ducking idea. We began to try and move the planchette in circles like you do when you're expecting an answer, and all of a sudden, it ducking stopped the hello spot on the board and would not ducking move. We actually slid the whole board off the table, trying to get it to move. It was being pushed down, hard. My boyfriend and I only had a finger each on it. I guess anything is possible, but I can't see how it could have been him, and I know it wasn't me. The next morning, I folded the board into 3 and buried it off of a nature trail at the edge of my town. There were really weird things happening in our house until recently. While I was in the bathroom late at night, what looked like 2 feet was obstructing the light shining under the door. The door to our office locks from the outside, and while my boyfriend and I were in there, it locked. His 2-year-old was in bed sleeping. I just don't think she's agile or tall enough to lock that door without anyone hearing her or noticing. Plus, that thing with my cat's hurt back leg. We would hear things in our bedroom being thrown around, and what sounded like people walking around in our living room at night. It all sort of gradually stopped. Nothing really obtrusive has been happening lately. So, I don't know if anyone's ever going to listen to this, but I feel like I need to get my story out here. When I tell people this story, they brush it off and just say, oh wow, that's creepy, but this event really took a toll on me. Anyway, this is a completely true story. I'll start it off with a little introduction. Hi, my name's Chloe, and 2 summers ago, when I was 15/16, I worked at an average sleepaway summer camp. I never went to the camp when I was a kid, but I did some first aid and lifeguard training there a year prior to being a counselor there, and I loved it. That's why I decided to work there, get all my volunteer hours, and spend my whole summer there, 4 weeks, to be exact. It was right on the water, and I thought it was going to be nice. I was wrong, very wrong. Everything was okay and absolutely normal until last week. So, the last week I worked was a senior girls' week, meaning girls aged 11 to 14 could attend, and all of the counselors were female. I had a cabin of 5 girls, 2 of whom were brats, so most of my time was delegated to them. All of these girls were 11 or 12. Now, the first 2 days of camp were fairly normal. I had a few homesick campers at bedtime, but with some positive reassurance, I got them to sleep. Homesickness with kids is usually only a problem at night, specifically the first few nights, as the kids adjust to being away from home. That's why I was so surprised. One of the most independent girls in my cabin, one of my favorites, woke me up by standing in front of me and waiting for me to wake up. Creepy, on the 3rd night. She tells me that she thinks there's something outside and that she wants to go home. This camp was on an island surrounded by forest. I told her it was probably just an animal. There were notorious deer and raccoons at the camp very often, and with some reassurance, I got her to go back to bed. Now I didn't think twice about this. Having worked for 3 weeks already, it was pretty common, honestly. Now this is where SHT starts getting weird. The next night, night 4, she did the same thing to wake me up. She tells me that she has to go to the bathroom, which is a bit of a walk away from our cabin. I got along with her, obviously. Once we're in the bathroom, in the light, it's pretty clear to me that she is wet herself. So I asked her about it, and she said it was just an accident. Alright, I had no problems with this. I let her get herself cleaned up and went to get one of the camp leaders. I was wondering what I should do about this girl's sleeping bag. So the camp leader's name was Elmo. Everyone at the camp had code names. Something fun for the kids, I guess? The girl in question's name is Karen. I don't know why I haven't mentioned that yet. So Elmo starts to ask this girl some questions. We're all still in the bathroom. I assume it was because this girl was 11, which is kind of old to be peeing the bed, especially when she was so independent thus far in the week and never had a problem going to the bathroom herself before. So Elmo asks Karen if there was a reason for the accident, and Karen answers that it was because she was scared. She was too scared to move or get out of her sleeping bag. Elmo asked what she was afraid of, and Karen said, the man. Now, I was standing over on the side, listening and chiming in here or there. I'm a believer in ghosts, openly, but at this moment, I can admit that I did not think anything of this. The things kids come up with, especially having worked with kids for 3 weeks, I wasn't really fazed. Elmo asked Karen which man she was referring to, and she couldn't seem to name him, but she described him, and this description is terrifying. Elmo asked if he was tall, and Karen said no, he was of average height. Elmo kept trying to joke around with this girl, I guess to try and make her fears less scary, but this girl was not having that shit. It's like she was trying to warn us, for real. Just how she spoke. Anyways, she tells us over a long period of Q&A that this demon is average height and not nice, he's a man, but he's not human. She said that he had been following her and her brother for a long time. She told us that one day she was playing in the forest at her grandparents' house, and that's when she met him. He scared her, and she ran away from him. She said he always followed her, and he was always with her when she slept away at different places. Honest to God, I should have seen the red flags all over that shit, but I didn't, I was tired, and it sounded like a kid's nightmare after watching a horror movie or something. After all that, my leader Elmo got this girl to calm down, she was crying as she told us this, and got her back to being with new sheets, blankets, and stuff, and she told Karen that our repair guy Shank was going to do some gsot busting for her in the morning and that everything would be okay. Then, at the counselors' meeting, before the kids were up, I told all my counselor friends about this. I didn't tell all the counselors, just my close personal friends. I didn't want this, what I believe to be funny, ghost story to get out to the kids, because that wouldn't be good. Kids take things seriously, and I didn't think anything of this. We all laughed about it, shrugged it off, and vowed not to tell anyone else what this girl had said. Well, just as I wrapped up that story for them, this other counselor girl named Ace walks into the break room. We didn't like Ace, she was, honestly, a shit. But we make small talk anyway, and then she tells us something that made my group look. Ace tells us that later last night, 2 girls from her cabin, age 13, went out to the bathroom together. As they were coming back from the bathroom, the 2 campers started to freak out and run, they felt like something was following them. They were both apparently crying when they got back to Ace's cabin, and Ace had to calm them down but got them back to sleep eventually. Now that was weird. My friend group and I decided not to tell Ace about my situation because she had a big mouth and was probably going to start something around the camp, which we were trying to avoid. Well, the rest of the day went by fine, completely normally. Near the end of the day, after the campfire, Shank, the repair guy, who also happens to be an actual ordained minister, invited me, Elmo, and Karen into the kitchen, and he blessed this big bag of salt for us. Now, he was doing this mostly as a comfort for Karen, as like a joke thing that you would do for a kid just to give them reassurance, but Shank told them to be careful anyways, he didn't like the way this situation was feeling. I just laughed and brushed him off. We spread the salt on the doorway and windows, making them lined with salt so the demon couldn't enter. Well, I thought this would solve our little foolish problem, right? Wrong. Karen pulls me aside before bedtime and looks up at me with the saddest face I have ever seen on a child. And all she says is, "Ink. That's my code name, this isn't going to work. I appreciate it a lot, but the demon likes salt. He's going to come for it." If that wasn't a perfect quote, it was something along those lines. The main point is, though, that our new demon friend likes salt. It was at this moment that everything hit me. I don't know why, but I started having a panic attack. I didn't let the kids see this, though. I told Karen just to try and get some rest, and I slipped out and ran to the kitchen in tears. I begged Shank to let me sleep in the break room and have one of the senior staff members take my cabin over for the night. He hugged me as I cried. I was so freaked out all of a sudden, and I don't know why it all hit me at once. I was so overrun by terror. Which I have never felt before or since. I felt as though something very bad was going to happen. Shank gave me another bag of blessed salt to keep with me, this is all true, I can't make this shit up, and told me I had to sleep in that cabin, I had to protect those kids, and that it was God's plan for me. Reflection on this, I think he was just ducking it with me, but your shit was horrified. I listened, though. I clutched my flashlight and the bag of salt as I tried to sleep that night, but I still had this ominous, horrifying feeling of fear and death looming over me. It was so creepy. I should note that this cabin was just a small room with 4 sets of bunk beds, 2 on either side of the room, and 2 windows, 1 at the back, if you're facing inward at the door, and 1 directly next to me. Directly outside the back window there was this big tree, so there wasn't much of a view, but you could see clearly out of mine. It must have been around 2 or 3 a.m., there were no phones allowed or any clocks in the cabin, so I had nothing to tell time or to stare at except the surrounding darkness. This is when shit really hit the fan. All the girls in my cabin, completely asleep, all inhale a deep breath at the same time, and exhale the word ink. That's my code name. So I whisper back, "Are you girls awake?" And I get nothing. After a few minutes of being absolutely petrified, I hear their normal snoring and shuffling sleeping sounds begin once again. That wasn't the end of the creepiness of this night for me, though. Next, a while later, I hear the door open. There was an outside screen door and an actual door inside. I had both doors closed. I hear the outer one creaking open. I become alert immediately, adrenaline coursing through me, am looking out my window and at the door, trying to see anything in the pitch blackness. When I see a black flash to my right, I look over and I see this entirely black being, leaning over one of my girls on the bottom bunk across from me, and as soon as I notice it, I see it reaching for this girl's face. I flicked my flashlight on and gripped the bag of salt, and I said, "God loves me. God loves me. God loves me." Over and over again. I shit y'all not, I see this black mass dart towards the door, and the door just opens, the inner door. It opens up wide, and I believe the demon has left. I still felt absolutely freaked out, but I didn't feel the same weight of terror as before. I didn't sleep a wink that night. As soon as I saw the sun start to come up from my window, I darted up and over to my good friend Marco's cabin. Before I could tell her anything about what I just saw, she told me that she was woken up in the middle of the night by someone or something breathing heavily outside of her window, next to her bed, but when she got up to check it out, thinking it was a kid or something, all she saw was a dark figure turning and going into the bushes, and she didn't see anything else. She brushed it off as a deer, probably. We went for an early morning shower, and I told her everything. That's not the end, though. Even though that was my last night and this was not the day we were supposed to leave, Marco and I were in the break room, waiting for others to wake up and join us for the morning meeting. Ace comes in and tells us something that made my blood run cold. Despite the fact that I had calmed down from the night's terrors, I felt oddly peaceful. She said that she had looked out her window before bed, around midnight, when the moon and stars were lighting up, and she said that she saw a black figure that looked like a person, leaning against the tree behind my cabin, looking in the window. Might I mention that, where she was describing having seen the figure, she would have been directly facing Kjaran's bed in our cabin. At this point, I decided to tell Ace about everything. I told everyone that there was too much substantial proof for them not to believe what I was telling them, which was the truth. Ace never knew about what Kjaran told me and Elmo/my experience with the demon, and yet she had two experiences of her own, with her girls being followed and seeing something looking into my cabin that seemed to match the description. And Elmo was there when Kjaran was telling us her story of this demon. When I got home from my week, I vowed never to go back to that camp. Yet I felt oddly safe. It didn't feel like the demon had followed me at all. I felt so oddly calm and peaceful in the following days. I told one of my friends who often has spiritual encounters and asked what he thought, and he told me something that creeped me out once again. He told me that when I was at camp, the same night I had the encounter with the demon, a spirit told him or showed him or something that I was in grave danger. And he said that he was praying for me that night repeatedly because he felt a connection to me and that something really bad was going on. He was so shocked to hear my story when I told him. He was positive that I had encountered some kind of demon that had latched itself onto this girl. I'm still freaked out by the experience today. This was a true story, no part of it was made up or exaggerated. If you actually read this, or are reading this, then let me know what you think. I don't know a lot about the paranormal, honestly, it scares me, especially now, but please tell me what you think this was or if what I saw and heard could have been a figment of my imagination. I hoped it was, but when I got up in the morning, the door I knew had closed the night before was still open after I saw the figure open it and dart out, so I was pretty sure it was real. Anyway, stay safe, guys. Pray for the girl, Kjaran. I hope she doesn't still have a demon following her. The most prominent experience I've had, the one example I know I was 100% conscious of, was when I was staying at my dad's a couple years ago. Whoever comes in last at night has to make sure they lock both the outside doors. I was in bed, winding down from my day, when I remembered I hadn't locked the main door, so I went downstairs to lock it. As I was coming up the stairs, I noticed a figure to my left in the open concept living room. I went to turn the corner away from said figure, towards my bedroom, when it hovered towards me. It seemed to almost lean on me, guiding me back to my room. I told it to duck off and went to bed. I've seen these a few times. I'm 30 years old now, and my first encounter began in 2012 while I was a freshman at college. I was on academic probation over a long weekend, so the rest of my roommates were gone for the weekend, and I was stuck in my dorm for the weekend all by myself. One night, as I had finished my homework and was tired of mindlessly scrolling through my phone, I got unusually tired and fell asleep in bed around 8 p.m. with the lights on. After about 20 minutes into my snooze, I felt like I wasn't alone and jolted awake. Our beds were over our desks in a bunk configuration. I rolled over and looked into the middle of the room below me and was shocked to see a humanoid figure curled up in the fetal position. I thought I was dreaming, so I just continued to blink and rub my eyes, telling myself to wake up, but soon realized I wasn't dreaming. After about 30 seconds, it seemed to register. I was staring at it, and it slowly stood up. I was in complete, utter shock and froze. It looked just like a person, but with no face or hair features, no clothes, just humanoid opaqueness. I couldn't even discern gender. It was about 5 feet 9 inches and slowly walked in my direction. Nothing felt evil or malicious about it, but I didn't want to test that theory. Unfortunately, it was between me and the door, and I had to run past it to escape my room. I yelled at it to stop approaching me. As soon as my fight or flight instinct overrode my being frozen in fear, and as it was only 3 feet away from me, I jumped from my bunk onto the floor and bolted past it. It never reached out or interfered with my escape as I ran out into the halls of my dorm with pure adrenaline and fear. With it being a weekend, there was hardly anybody present, but I cooled myself down and quickly walked to find the closest human contact I could find. I finally found one of my friends down the hall who was still present. As to not sound insane, I didn't tell a soul of my experience as to not sound crazy. I chalked it up to being tired and stressed with school, but unfortunately, I had to eventually make my way back to the room to sleep alone. I finally summoned the courage to leave my friend's room and go back to mine after a few hours. I entered my room, and there was nothing there. I stayed awake with the lights on the rest of the night with an uneasy feeling, but nothing else happened. Fast forward to 2013, and my roommates and I had switched to a different room. Every year we had to switch rooms. Nothing else had happened until late last fall. This time all of my roommates were present, and it was a school night, and we had all just begun to fall asleep, 3 of us total. Once again, I got that uneasy feeling, and once again, I rolled over to find the humanoid figure standing near the head of my bed, reaching up towards me. I absolutely freak out and wake up my roommates, who throw the light on. As soon as the light came on, it disappeared. To my roommates' justifiable annoyance, they told me to go to sleep and that I'm just imagining things. This occurred 2 more times throughout my college years. The last college incident occurred in my senior year. Once again, I was asleep and awoke to an uneasy feeling. I had accidentally left my closet open, and as I peered into it, I saw the figure again, just standing there staring into me. I fixate on it, just telling myself it's just my overactive imagination, but as I was wishing it away, it stepped out of the closet, and just like other times, it began to approach me. I scream at it, demanding it not to take a step closer or else, and it disappears into nothingness. This leads to the final encounter I had with shadow people in 2020. My wife was pregnant with my son at the time, and I was a month out from deployment, knocking out my pre-deployment training. This last encounter was different from the rest and was the single most terrifying paranormal, or stress-induced, event I've witnessed. I was asleep with my wife in bed. I had only been asleep for an hour when I woke up because I couldn't breathe. I had felt 2 hands wrapped around my neck and weight on my chest. As I struggled to breathe, I saw the shadow person above me, and it felt like it was trying to suffocate me. I hadn't even registered it as a shadow person. I thought it was a home invader. I wrestled with it, or at least felt like I was, and I could feel it and grab it. Once I got the upper hand, it sprung to the bedroom floor and crawled under my bed. My wife was already awake as I was thrashing about. Thinking it was an intruder, I was trying to find a weapon and told my wife to escape the house and call the cops. She, of course, refused and told me it was all a bad dream. I looked under the bed to find nothing there, of course. My wife told me that I was just stressed with the upcoming deployment. I was incredibly embarrassed and utterly terrified. I left the house just in case and tried to work on my stress. That was the last encounter, and I haven't had another one since. I used to love the woods. I loved the quiet, peace, and tranquility of the forest, the sort of haven that gave me a minor distraction from the outside world. I would go exploring a lot when I was a kid and eat up any sort of nature documentary I could get my hands on. That was until I moved into my most recent house. Now I stay far away from those woods. I often go on my porch at night and just stare at the tree line as my eyes gaze into the impenetrable darkness. I know there's something there, just out of sight, grazing back at me. Introduction. My property dates back to the 1800s, and it is a true 1800s looking property. The original house I used to live in here was something out of an old-timey scary movie. The same could be said with the barn on my property. Either way, everything here was built by the original owners way back when they were making the buildings, and this property is very, very old. And I partly think this relates to the problems I've had here. I usually don't tell these stories, but after looking at this channel, I feel like maybe someone will understand. I'll talk about the main problem, which is the woods. These encounters took place over the course of 10 years. The knocks. I was sitting down by the river behind my house with my grandfather one afternoon. We were fishing and having a good time. I was thrilled with spending time with my grandfather, and fishing at the time was our favorite activity. I remarked to him about a Bigfoot hunting show I was watching on TV and found out he watched the same show. A big part of the Bigfoot show is knocking on trees with wood to make a big sound. The rumor is that Bigfoot will knock back to communicate with you. I always had a strange feeling about those woods, something just wasn't right about them. There were two sides connected by a bridge. One side was the one my grandfather and I were on. This side is warm and nice, birds sing and crickets do their thing, but on the other side of the river, once you cross that bridge, it's dead, no noise, no sun, no cold, no birds, no crickets, no animals, and all the plants there are dead. You get a chill running down your spine and instantly feel like you just shouldn't be there. Yay, I always had a weird vibe about it, so joking around with my grandfather, I took a block of wood and banged it against the nearest tree. We laughed until we heard a bang come from the woods. My grandfather stopped dead in his tracks and gazed deep into the woods. I banged twice. It banged twice back. I banged 3 times. It banged 3 times. I banged once. It banged once, until finally the banging just stopped. My grandfather brushed it off, but something about it didn't settle right with me. I made up my mind at that moment to find out what made that noise, a decision I would come to regret. The screams. Fast forward a couple of months, and I was in the very same woods with a friend and her dad, only on the other side of them. As we walked, I told her the story about the knocks. And kids being kids, we decided to name the monster in my woods, and I'm not very proud to admit we settled on Jerry. When we got to the heart of the woods, we found 3 broken down cars down there, like old cars from the 1960s. They're arranged in the shape of a triangle, separated by a couple of yards between them. One on top of a hill, the other in a clearing, and the last one in the middle of some brush. No roads lead into those woods, there are only rickety old bridges that are half rotten, so I don't even know why they are there. We all walk up to the cars and look at them. I never go into the woods without a walking stick. Being a young boy, I take the stick and give the car a good hit. My friend laughs, but as soon as I hit that ducking car, all hell broke loose. I'm not talking about anger screaming, I'm talking about the type of screaming someone does when they're about to die. It sounded like a woman was getting butchered right in front of us, and it didn't stop. It kept getting louder and louder, and it was all around us. My friend and I freaked out. I went to ask her dad what he thought. When I looked up at him, I saw complete and utter fear. This guy grew up in the heart of Mass. He doesn't scare easily. Seeing him like that, his face completely pale just staring into the brush, was awful. All he said was "let's go," and as we were walking out, the screaming continued. As we left the area, it kept screaming louder and louder until we crossed the bridge. As soon as our bodies broke the threshold of the bridge, the screams completely stopped. Knocks Part 2. After that encounter, the same friend made it our mission to find Jerry and find out exactly what it was. In hindsight, this was very stupid, but I was just a dumb kid, and I didn't know it would lead to everything it did. We were talking about my first encounter and about the knocking. She got the idea to try and use the knocks to communicate. It seemingly wasn't a bad idea, and I figured it couldn't hurt to try. I knew something was out there, and I just wanted answers. "Knock once if you don't want us to go into the woods," I yelled across the river. We waited about 15 seconds until there was a knock, but this wasn't like the first one. This knock sounded like it came from metal on metal, very similar to the sound the car in the woods made when I hit it with a stick. "Knock twice if you want us to stay on this side of the bridge." Again, 2 knocks. One right after the other, sounding like it was beating on those old cars. I was stunned by the first set of knocks, sure that there could have been someone ducking with me. But the second pair of knocks had the same event happening twice, only this time it was using the knocks to communicate with us. I asked it again to knock if it didn't want us out there, and it knocked as soon as I asked the question. This taught me 3 things. 1. It did not want us out there poking around, but what could it be hiding? 2. It's the cars. Something about those cars, when I hit them, those screams came for us, and now it was using them to communicate. Finally, whatever it is, it's smart and it can communicate. This freaked me out because answering questions shows intelligence and understanding. It has its own set of wants and desires that it can communicate. And it's strong enough to bang on a metal car, meaning it can interact with the physical world. Imposter. This was the last hunt my friend joined me on. We were walking down to the river, spinning our thoughts and theories about Jerry. We knew it could communicate, we knew it didn't want us in the woods, we knew it could interact with physical objects, and lastly, we knew there was something about those cars. We got down into the clearing where the river is and were about to start walking into the woods when we heard Carly. We heard her mother's voice call her name and didn't think anything of it. We figured she wanted her to come out of the woods. So we left the river and walked back up to my house, where we found her mom. Sitting in her car with heavy death metal music blasting, she knocked on her mom's window, and her mom opened it. "Hey, did you call my name earlier?" "No, I've been sitting here listening to music." My heart sank when we heard her name. It wasn't just me that heard it, she heard it too. We both looked at each other and instantly thought the same thing. That thing changed its voice to sound like her mom, and it knew her name. We never ended up going into the woods that day, and I often wonder if it called her name to distract us, so we never got to go out and look for it. Either way, that's the last time she helped me search for it. My new partner, I got one of my other friends to help me search for Jerry. He agreed to help because my river is a popular fishing spot in town. I told him about the strange happenings in the woods, and while he and another friend were fishing down there, they walked into the woods and tore a steering wheel out of the old cars. And then I proceeded to be chased out of the woods by the same screams. Either way, he agreed to help me, and we went out there about 8 times, and each time the feeling in those woods got more and more hostile. I can see why I knew it didn't want me there, but I kept walking deep into the dragon's den, expecting not to get burned. When we were in there, it got to the point where, if we were walking and then stopped suddenly, we could hear the crunch of twigs and leaves being smashed under heavy footsteps, tree branches snapping as something walked through them. It was easy to tell something was following us the whole time. Watching us from afar and keeping track of our movements, we felt like animals being stalked from afar. One day I was sitting in a tree, surveying the land. And that's when I saw an arm just sitting on a tree. The arm was wrapped around the tree like it was hugging it. Its skin was black and gray like the bark of the trunk. I only saw it because it had happened to pick up its arm and move it behind the tree. During another investigation, we were in the woods one day doing an investigation when suddenly I felt a cold chill go up to my spine. I felt it behind me. I don't know how, but I said, "Jimmy, take a picture behind me right now." He snapped the photo without question, and that's when we saw it. Standing behind me was a small figure, probably about 5 feet tall, in completely black robes with a hood covering its head and no face. I was stunned. I couldn't believe it. In the photo, there was a hooded shadow figure standing behind me. Of course, this only meant something was coming, and I wish I never turned my head to look to my right. I heard something over there, and I don't know why, but I decided to look. Its shape was that of a human, but it had no features. It was broad daylight, yet its skin was completely black, like a shadow. Its arms were super long, and it was so skinny that it almost looked like a stick figure. I could make out its head, arm, and torso, which were human in shape, but then its legs were bent backward like a dog or a wolf. It moved on all fours, so ducking fast, quicker than anything I've ever seen in my life. I'm a horse farmer, and I've seen horses run full speed, and this thing made them look slow. I just happened to turn my head at the right moment. I locked eyes with it in that split second. Well, it didn't have any eyes, but I could feel it look at me, and at that moment, I knew I saw something I was never supposed to see. It was running beside me, but I was never meant to see that. It ran by a tree and disappeared into thin air. I've never run so fast in my life. I was terrified. What the duck was it? That thing wasn't some small little thing in a hood. This was some sort of animal, human mix, or something. It was awful. The goat. In one of the last encounters I had with Jerry, I was walking down to the river. All of a sudden, the wind picked up out of nowhere, and the trees started bending and dancing in the wind. And then a laugh cut through the woods, an evil laugh, a menacing laugh, followed by a goat belting louder than anything I've ever heard. That was the last time I went down there. It was the first time something had happened on my side of the bridge, the safe side. Jerry always stayed by his side and never came over to mine. Well, he changed that, and I threw in the towel. I was never going out there again. I had eyewitnesses. I had evidence. I had locked eyes with the thing, and now it was coming over to my side of the river, invading my home like I invaded it. I was done, and I told him that. I went to the river one last time. The wind picked up again instantly, with trees whipping all around the woods and groaning all around me. And I apologized for everything for going out there and disturbing its home. After hitting the car to actually try to hunt it, I apologized and told that thing I never wanted to see or hear from it ever again. As soon as I said those words, the wind died, the trees stilled, and the woods made noise again. I agreed to never go into his woods, as long as he never crossed the bridge again. If he stayed on his side, I agreed to stay on mine. One last encounter. It had been a couple of months since my deal had been struck, and the activity in the woods slowed to zero. There was nothing if you went down there, it was still creepy, but nothing at all like before. I had wondered if my otherworldly friend had gone to wherever he came from, however. One of my friends slept over. I told him about my story with Jerry, and he didn't. Believe me, he ran outside, onto my porch, and before I could stop him, he yelled into the woods, "I'm not scared of you, you're a coward." I asked him to stop, but he yelled it again and said, "I'm not scared. I got God on my side." He was cut off by the sound of metal crunching down on metal. His face turned white, and fear poured into his eyes. He had yelled at Jerry and called him out, and Jerry responded with one of his signature knocks. My friend ran back into my house, freaking out really bad, asking me, "What the duck is it? What the duck is out there?" So we sat down in my room, and he let me tell him more. It was then that we both heard crack as my doorknob turned, and with a pop, my door opened slowly and slowly, inching its way until it was completely open. The whole time, I and my friend watched it, holding our breaths as fear consumed us. He was even more freaked out than before and left the next day, telling his family what had happened as he got into the car. Jerry had never left like I thought he might have. He was simply waiting and listening until he had to make himself known again. Closing thoughts. After my run-in with Jerry and even more spirits on my property, my mom was sitting down with an old-timer of the town we live in. They were talking about ghosts, and she told her my story, which the old-timer revealed. When she was a young girl, a bunch of town officials got into trouble. Because it was discovered, they were all part of a satanic cult, even the sheriff was a part of it. The rumor around town is that they even did rituals and sacrificed people. Do I think Jerry is a byproduct of that? I don't know. Do I think that hooded figure is connected? I don't know. I've been trying to figure out for years what happened out there and, most importantly, what that thing I saw was. If you have any ideas, feel free to let me know. After the activity with Jerry died down, I still encountered many spirits on my property, yet I know nothing. The only thing I do know is that those woods are his, and I'm never going out there again. It's been about 3 years now since Jerry and I've had no run-ins with him since I still get curious and wonder if he's still out there. But when I look into the woods and feel those eyes staring back,